Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming today. I want to welcome you to our presentation, A Tangled Web, Understanding Chinese Technological Investment in Africa. So our names are Tiffany and Sarah. Our amazing mentor this year was Eric Lynn Greenberg, and we are part of the Perry Worldhouse Student Fellows cohort of 2019 to 2020. So before we dive in, we want to give a quick overview of where we're going today. So we'll start off by introducing the problem, from realizing the potential for human rights abuses to taking a closer look at tech investment in Africa through China. Second, we'll walk you through our proposal in looking more at solutions that can hold both China and Africa accountable. And finally, we'll look ahead and see where the international community goes from here.
So it's clear that through China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road, that China's sphere of influence continues to grow. And as it's trying to expand its reach globally, moving into spaces like the African continent, coupled with the fact that China's become a pioneer in AI and 5G technology, this has already proven as some hindrance to human rights violations, and controversies already exist, such as with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And now as China's sphere of influence continues to grow and China's direct investment into places in Africa continue to increase as well, we're afraid that these human rights violations are being exported to countries in Africa. So there's 3 different sectors in which these emerging technologies are proving to be a hindrance to human rights. So the first is in surveillance equipment, and this is mostly seen in the safe cities technology in Kenya, in which there's been increased crowd monitoring and video surveillance through the use of CCTVs on every street corner. Now, there's obviously benefits to this in lowering the amount of crime, and especially with the increase in terrorism that has happened in Kenya. However, there are many challenges to this, as there's a lot of political instability in many of these African countries. And with the political instability, there's a lack of data protection laws in which citizens can often be under surveillance for copious amounts of time, and data on the internet can also be surveyed as well. So facial recognition through the use of AI is another sector of technology, and AI is an emerging technology in which China's become sort of the spearhead for. There's many dangers to this, as a lot of this facial recognition data can be sent back to China and allow China to have unilateral access to this data. And facial recognition and a lot of this data collection can also be used to manipulate opposition groups and manipulate elections in African states. So putting pressure and singling out minorities in these states. And then the final sector is in data collection. So through the use of telecommunications, satellites, and data privacy concerns, there's a lot of monitoring happening online. And there's a lot of privacy violations that have led to human rights accusations in these states. So in Nigeria, there has been $550 million worth of communications investment, and this has led to many data privacy concerns. Another state is Rwanda, in which, again, data privacy concerns have arisen, and this has a lot to do with the DNA database that has been instilled into Rwanda. Rwanda is a very special case as well because of the very recent track record with human rights. It is considered to be probably the most stable out of the African states that we're analyzing. And with the addition of a DNA database, this proves to be especially dangerous for Rwanda, as it has the ability to target minority groups. And then moving on to Kenya. Like I said before, Kenya is one of the states that has taken a lot of Chinese investment in recent years. Just in 2019, it took $666 million worth of investment. And a lot of this comes from Huawei and the introduction of 5G, and again, the safe cities technology. And finally, in Zimbabwe, we were mainly looking at the CloudWalk technology company that is known for facial recognition and exporting AI into this state.
So we also want to explore the possible avenues of human rights abuses. So you'll notice in the last slide that the countries in Africa that we chose were from all over the continent, which really exemplifies that despite the problems that each country has when it comes to Chinese technological investment, this isn't a situation that's only contained to one area of Africa, and instead it's truly a continent-wide issue. So specifically when it comes to minority groups, this raises a lot of concerns in terms of targeting, surveilling, and monitoring such groups through video surveillance and facial recognition technology. And so again, while the key states for concern include Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Rwanda, these are only a few states out of the entirety of the African continent that are currently looking at a problem like this. When it comes to Africa to China, facial recognition data sent to China can also enhance non-Han Chinese tracking capabilities. On the other hand, you have privacy concerns. So these concerns include invasion of online privacy and covert data collection of personal information without user consent. The key states for concerns out of the case studies that we chose are Rwanda and Nigeria, and in the Africa to China relationship, user data can create a surveillance map for the Chinese Communist Party for possible election manipulation or data infringement. Again, the question of targeting minority groups and privacy concerns aren't the only avenues of human rights abuses, and yet those are the two that we currently see as the most pressing. So on the left, you'll see a picture of the Uyghur minority group in China, many of whom are currently being prosecuted under the Chinese Communist Party. And we wanted to include both this and the following quote by UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zaid Rad Al Hussein, because we want to include it as a cautionary tale. Zaid spoke that when the fundamental principles of human rights are not protected, the center of our institution no longer holds. It is they that promote development that is sustainable, peace that is secure, and lives of dignity, which really emphasizes the importance of looking further at tech investments into Africa, not just accepting it for face value.
So moving on to the proposal part of the presentation, we are prepared to offer a two-tiered policy proposal for accountability. So moving on to the next slide, the first three proposals are about holding China accountable and for sort of taking down or eliminating China's role in these African states. And the latter two are more about holding African states accountable. So there's definitely room for overlap in these solutions, and they could easily apply either way. For example, global media monitoring could be used to keep African states accountable and not just China. And we've also adapted these policy solutions so that as the situation continues to develop, as with cybersecurity, there's a lot of unprecedents, we can be able to adapt as well. So the first proposal is from an international perspective, and it's to provide alternative technological sources for these African states to sort of eliminate the need for Chinese technology. So this would be through the creation of a digital development fund, and we propose that it would be a standalone agency created through Congress and the executive branch. Now, there's a very detailed report that was published by CNAS that kind of describes and lays out the whole what a digital development fund would look like. So mainly it would authorize the use of lines of credit. So this would give preference to US firms while also lowering the cost of US technology, because as we know, cost is often the primary factor for some of these developing countries to take into account. And American products have not been as attractive in the current markets because for Chinese firms, cybersecurity and the risk of espionage are often secondary priorities, which is often a little bit more prioritized by American firms. So in short, the fund would offer prospects of economic advancement for US technology firms to invest in Africa, and it would also have the added benefit of mitigating human rights violations. So it would also establish contingencies for the recipient countries, so states like Kenya, Rwanda, etc., and emphasize the human rights norms compliancy. So with these contingencies for these developing countries, they would have to adhere to universal norms of human rights. And also, this would allow US firms to invest more in Africa and to follow up with monitoring, as monitoring would be extremely important in making sure that these states are adhering to the contingencies at place. Now, there is a benefit to this, besides the fact that the US would just have more investment elsewhere. Um, these countries are often left indebted to China. As I said before, Kenya just accepted $666 million worth of investment for a data center. Now, a lot of this investment has been in the form of loans. It's mainly been in loans. So the possibility to mitigate this aspect of being indebted to China would also prove as another incentive for these states to choose American tech sources over Chinese.
So going along the avenue of international efforts, we also propose a best practices approach. And this would be spearheaded by the United States, acting as a leader for technological best practices. Now, that's not to say that the United States is perfect, because it certainly had its fair share of complications when it comes to emerging technology. For example, surveillance equipment with the NSA Snowden leak, as well as recent facial recognition technology in airports. But it's important to note that in every situation, the United States has been very open to congressional hearings, to listening to dissenters, and to ultimately modifying any technology and placing restrictions when needed. So this goes to show that while the US isn't perfect, it is a good example of a country that's willing to evolve and adapt when it comes to technology. So on a more tangible side, the best practices approach in Africa would be twofold. The first is to create oversight hearings, or a space for oversight and regulation hearings if technology is to be found abusive. And on the other hand, we would also really encourage expert panels. So we would invite technological leaders from all over the world to advise African policymakers on potential misuses, thus forming a best practices approach. Another one of our solutions is global media monitoring. So it begins like this. First, you start off with increased media coverage of the issue. Then this raises more public awareness, and finally, a heightened global response. When you plug this into the formula of human rights abuses and technology in Africa, you can see that increased media coverage of the tech abuses in Africa could lead to increased public awareness and then push for this heightened global response from leaders. It's important to note that while this is an optimistic solution, it may not necessarily be entirely feasible, considering that reporters often chase sensationalist stories or stories that will attract their readers the most. So it's a matter of really being able to craft and frame the stories that will pull reporters to increase media coverage and thus more awareness. So as I mentioned before, there are certainly challenges when it comes to global media monitoring. It's just the reality of such a situation. One of them is this low prioritization of African conflict and news stories. So it will take collective efforts to really show the media that Africa is newsworthy and these stories are necessary to be covered. In addition, for the heightened global response, it could take many forms. This includes institutional response from places like the United Nations, or responses from individual countries like the US, or finally responses from different coalitions like the AU or the EU. However, when it comes to the UN specifically, China's role on the Security Council may prevent UN condemnation, so that's something to be aware of, and to realize that the burden of responsibility might fall on states like the US, or again, groups such as the EU or the AU. And finally, the last challenge is that naming and shaming may produce no tangible results. There have been studies on both sides of the aisle, some that have shown that naming and shaming work, and others that show naming and shaming don't. So it's a matter of examining the situation, seeing what comes from it, and adjusting any solutions as needed.
So overall, for the international efforts, there is definitely a sort of unilateral approach that we've proposed in terms of having the US take the lead in the Digital Development Fund and in promoting the best practices. However, there is a lot of room for more states and more actors to get involved, such as the EU in the case of global media monitoring, and also in the best practices approach. So now we're going to move on to local accountability. And the first proposal that we have is to fund grassroots organizations. So this funding could come from organizations like the UN. And there's a lot of incentives to this. So for grassroots organizations, funding from the international community, whether that be from the UN or from the US specifically, this can be used to help keep NGOs on the ground active and able to do more to hold these states accountable because of the political instability that plagues many of these African states and the inability of international organizations to really produce any tangible results on the ground. So this is more of a bottom-up approach, and there's two different human rights organizations that we thought would be very helpful. So the first one is the Kenya Human Rights Commission, and obviously located in Kenya. Its main mission is to safeguard civic space and create the necessary frameworks to help and mobilize civil society and keep civil society informed, while also trying to produce some sort of change in the local government. And then also in the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, there are two different sectors that we think would be very useful, and that's the Transitional Justice Unit and the Public Interest Unit. So both these organizations would specifically be helpful for these issues of data privacy and with the emerging technologies. Because a lot of this technology is so unprecedented, there aren't a lot of organizations that are already funded based solely on this mission. However, we think that these different groups could definitely adapt. So as for results, there's a lot that can be done with the funding specifically. The first one is to instill consistent monitoring so that citizens and the international community knows what's going on and what is happening on the ground, as misinformation can be spread very quickly. So it is also important to keep civilians informed of the new technology as it moves and changes so rapidly, and their rights to mobilize civil society. There's also the opportunity for funding to be used to handle individual court cases in the case of very extreme violations of human rights. And finally, like I said before, there is the ability to establish safeguards, technological safeguards, whether that comes in the form of VPNs or also in training for state officers or people working in public administration. Now, there's obviously a downside to funding grassroots organizations just because there's been a rough relationship between NGOs and the state. In Kenya, there was the deregistration of the KHRC, which happened in 2017. However, with international pressure and public comments by people like Zaid through Amnesty International, the KHRC was able to overcome it and went to the High Court of Kenya and was able to disregard the deregistration. So there are ways to go around this rough relationship between the NGOs and the state, as there has been change, there has been promising results and things that can be done to mitigate these human rights violations.
And our final solution for local accountability is to create watchdog groups. So the anatomy of a watchdog group is as follows. It would be created and funded by institutions like the UN or willing states such as the US. We will also include the possibility that coalitions like the EU and the AU could once again step in here. It would be staffed by local activists who are familiar with the community and well respected by local populations. We feel it would be best to have activists on the ground rather than foreigners, because we do feel like the activists will be able to build a better and stronger relationship with local populations and community members. And finally, this watchdog group would monitor the situation on the ground and provide consistent reports to international community on potential ethics violations. Now again, there are challenges to every solution, and these are as follows. For one, there is the possibility that these local activists could become targets, especially in the corrupt governments and corrupt states that they're trying to examine. However, we feel that with the support, resources, and reputations of these international institutions and states putting pressure on these governments, this will help protect local staff members in a way that they wouldn't be if they were simply working for a locally funded nonprofit. In addition, there's been a lot of call recently for what's called guard dog groups. So watchdog groups are tasked with reporting back on ethics violations and generally taking a larger backseat in regards to the situation on the ground. Whereas guard dog organizations are often the ones making arrests and forcing corrupt officials out of office. However, we do feel like there are lower chances of corruption for a watchdog group than for a guard dog group. Some of the issues that guard dog group face are high levels of funding and more focus on criminal violations and less on ethical issues. And we feel that, at least for the situation in Africa, a watchdog group would be better suited to tackle the problems there, especially considering that it would be difficult for any kind of group to really force corrupt government and federal officials out of office. So it may be best for now if these groups take a step back, monitor, report, and frequently check in with the international community to keep them up to date and see if intervention is needed.
Now, looking ahead, there are a few things that we can do to keep in mind while understanding the situation as it unfolds and what steps to take in this situation as it develops. So the first step is to make sure we have and garner enough support from the international community and allow the international community to extend its support to these African states. This is a case in which naming and shaming could be of use just to shed light on the issue that's happening and make sure that as many states as possible, as well as international organizations, understand specifically what is happening on the ground and what's happening with the Chinese investment that's going into Africa. So the next is adaptability. Like I said before, we've adopted these policy proposals with the idea in mind that technology is constantly changing, and as these emerging technologies continue to develop and as the situation continues to unfold on the ground, that's definitely something to keep in mind, is that these policy proposals and solutions can be adapted to include more states and a more multilateral approach as more light gets shed on the issue. And finally, it's important that we maintain consistency. So maintaining consistent monitoring on the ground is especially important for making sure we have the most accurate information as to what's actually happening. Now, this is where keeping contact and keeping a very good and open line of communication with grassroots organizations on the ground is extremely important and should be considered a priority, because they are the ones that are able to gain the most reach and the most coverage and let the rest of the international community know how the situation continues to unfold.
So with that, we want to thank you so much for virtually being here for a presentation. A huge shout out to our mentor, Eric, for being there every step of the way and with all of our highs and lows of this project. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.